5.
Kia ora koutou katoa. I begin by acknowledging the ancestors of Rangitane, whose land, wisdom, and care shape the spaces for these conversations. Welcome to the next lecture in the Applied Communication Futures lecture series. And it's a real pleasure to invite Professor Heather Zoller to dialogue with us as part of the series. Now, Heather and I go long ways, all roads, as is often said, lead to Purdue in communication studies, and our paths intersected when I started my journey at Purdue and when Heather wrapped up her journey at Purdue and was beginning her journey as an assistant professor at University of Cincinnati. And we have since then collaborated, worked together, learned from each other, debated, had arguments. And I really have appreciated the opportunity to learn from Heather in terms of the ways in which she not only writes about, but lives the politics of building open spaces, the kind of political project that I feel is really relevant to our times, particularly in terms of learning the habits of dialogue and building broad spaces. Professor Heather Zoller is professor of communication at the University of Cincinnati, where she directs the Communicating Health Science, Environment, and Risk certificate. A lot of her own work explores the intersections of work, organizing, health, and environment. She's the current editor-in-chief of the Journal of Applied Communication Research, and before this, she served as senior editor of Management Communication Quarterly and the journal Health Communication. Her research exploring the intersections of healthy work, sustainable development questions, equitable economic systems is published in a variety of top journals in the field, including Communication Monographs, Journal of Applied Communication Research, Human Relations, and the Handbook of Organizational Communication Theory and Research. Heather and I worked together in co-editing the book, Emerging Perspectives in Health Communication, which is often adopted in seeking to decenter the post-positivism of the field. She is a member of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, NIOSH Committee on PPE, and served as board president for Ohio Citizen Action Education Fund. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us, Heather, and looking forward to learning from you.
Thanks so much, and thank you so much for not saying just how long it's been since we've been collaborating and working together. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, whatever time it is for you, or perhaps this is somebody who's watching the recording later. I was asked to speak about the future of applied communication research from the position of the editorship at the Journal of Applied Communication Research, as well as to talk about some of my own experiences. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my editorial vision at JACR and talking about how applied research can meet the moment, some of the challenges in doing that, and then again, depending on how much time we have, talking a bit about my own work and sort of the meaning of critical pragmatism. So first, why did I want to edit JACR, which I've been doing now for about a year and a half, not that I'm counting the days. Mohan, I took over from Mohan, so he knows how much work it is to edit the journal. But it is something that it was always in the back of my mind as a goal, because its mission is closely aligned with my orientation to scholarship. So I do view myself as a critical pragmatist, so that the point of research for me is to translate that research into practice, as it's particularly democratic social change. And Mohan talked about some of these issues, about my background, and I'll talk more about them later. The other reason that I was interested in editing JACR is because I felt like it was a crucial moment for the field in terms of developing and applying communication insights. We are all around the globe living with multiple crises and issues and problems that the journal can speak directly to. Before I talk more about the vision that I published, though, I did want to emphasize that work at the journal is not something I'm doing alone. Again, thanks to Mohan and to Debbie Doherty for their help as I transitioned into the role. And since then, I also have put together a team, including Julius Riles and Xiaohai Zhang, for associate editors, because I did want to make sure that the journal maintained its multi-methodological approach, and so they have expertise in quantitative methods. And then my editorial assistant, Andy Chang, if you submit, which of course I hope you do, you'll probably interact with Andy. And then Usman and Shoba are part of the media team. So I titled my editorial vision publication, Applied Communication Research as a Discipline of Crisis and Care in Meeting the Moment. And I talked about this idea of being a discipline of crisis. I'm borrowing from environmental communication, which has long considered itself a discipline of crisis. But I'm making the broader argument that if you're connected to applied communication research, you need to be connected to the problems that people are experiencing. And we have these major intertwined crises related to climate change, health disparities, income inequality, as well as inequality related to ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and more. We're also experiencing technological change and the misinformation and political polarization that comes with that, the disruption, the economic precarity, the recolonization through the economy. And these are all intertwined together, right? So they're really complex. At the same time, I also heeded the advice of the late Steve Schwartz, who said, environmental communication isn't just a crisis discipline. We're not just reacting to crisis. We want to be proactive. We want to help address these issues. And I also drew from Phaedra Pazula talking about environmental communication as a care discipline. That is, we can also articulate visions of personal, social, and ecological flourishing. We can talk about things like equity and sustainability and wellness and peace. And I'll talk a little bit more about that idea of care and crisis as we go. The second part of meeting the moment is also to redress those long-standing academic silences and biases that people have taken the work to point out and to revise, challenging patterns of whiteness, colonialism, patriarchy, and more. And of course, meeting the moment, this is long overdue, right, in terms of thinking about how to replace and expand our foundational assumptions. I was doing some research on a chapter this week and came across again this quote from Debashish Munshi that I just really resonates, talking about the ivory tower of reason and rationality that colonizes lived experience so that people seeking academic legitimacy, it says, for their narratives from the heart end up echoing the sanitized tone of the master narrative. So what can we do to change that? In my vision, in addition to talking about meeting the moment, I also outlined a vision for building a community around JACR. The journal, I think, is interesting in that not everyone is sure if that's the right journal for them to submit to. A lot of people think about themselves as doing applied research, but they may not identify as an applied researcher. And so, again, creating stronger connections with the board, with reviewers, with the NCA and ICA divisions was a part of my vision. And how could we do that while increasing the diversity and inclusion of the journal? And again, that care component, doing applied research, doing engaged research is difficult. It's so much more difficult in, just dealing with one side of the equation, just practicing and no research, theory and not without the practice. So if people are going to be engaging with this, how can we support one another in that process? And of course, if we're doing research that matters, we're doing the hard work of engagement, we wanted to make sure that people see it. So, increasing the impact of the journal and boosting visibility was also a goal of mine. I'm not going to get into the minutia of some of the different ways that I've tried to put that into practice, and my team is putting that into practice. But I did pull out just a few examples to show you what we're doing. One of the things I did is slightly, as much as I could, rewrote the about the journal's mission, and the call for papers. I wanted to clarify that papers here need to contribute to both theory and practice so that people understand if this is the right outlet for their work. I emphasized that in the directions as well, that work needs to consider diversity, inclusion, and equity. Don't send me pieces with all white samples, for example, unless there's a specific reason why that was the group that was chosen. I also raised the word count to 9,500 to be more inclusive of qualitative research, and made a few other updates there. I'm really excited about the new field reports section of the journal. These are not tales from the field. Instead, this is a place for people to talk about applied interventions and projects that they've engaged in without the sort of theoretical scaffolding, with greater focus on what happened as a result of the intervention and what are the transferable insights that people can take away for other projects. This is partly to increase our relationship with practitioners, to allow more applied work into the journal, and also to create space for academics and practitioners from the Global South who often are, because they are dealing with crucial issues of survival sometimes, they're less interested in the theory building, and so this then would create a space for that. I do welcome those. It's been slow to get started, so we have published one with Stevens et al. On rectifying a flood data desert. We have a few more in the works. And I also created a special issue call that's looking at translational reviews and also some field reports. But the idea here was to take stock of the insights that communication already has that can be applied to address the roots of these fundamental connected crises. What can we do to prevent them? When it's not possible to prevent them, what can we do to fundamentally reshape them? So the idea of translation, again, is encouraging people to think about what do we know and how can we communicate that to others in ways that can be useful. A few other things. My media team is raising visibility for timely research like this disaster preparedness and recovery piece, and doing more to create, if not open publishing, then at least to do free to view. For example, with this piece on the sharing economy, that seemed really crucial. And we've got more community building, we've got awards, we have newsletters for our board, but also, contributors, anyone can sign up for the newsletter. So those are some of the things that we've been doing. Now I thought I might talk a little bit about some challenges. And these are challenges I think we all face, but certainly things I've noticed since I've taken over at the journal in terms of meeting that moment and moving applied research towards the future. So one of the challenges I see with JACR is, doesn't everybody who studies communication study practice, right? We have this long-standing connection to practice. We talk about the idea of pragmatics, for example. But I think we need to push ourselves in understanding that studying practice doesn't necessarily mean applied research. And I'll talk about that more, another challenge I see is that there's still this legacy of the theory-practice split, right? Like the name of the journal, Applied Communication Research, sort of harkens back to that time when there was theoretical work and then there was that applied work over there, right? And I don't know whether it's true, but I have heard a few people say, well, someone at that university, their department doesn't really count JACR as a major publication. And we have a 5 to 6% acceptance rate. We are an NCAA journal. Really, what standard are they using if they're not considering this a major publication? Again, to me, that reflects a kind of outmoded view of this strong split between theory and practice. And so what I'm encouraging us to do is to think more about how we build theories that robustly and ethically inform practice. And what are some of the challenges in doing that? One thing I see is a continued focus on theory as a mirror of nature, right? So quantitative folks, for example, sometimes will get so invested in creating a model that in a particular study you think, well, why are you doing this? You already know what the outcome is going to be. Well, yes, but it'll show the model is true, right? But what is the model going to do besides reflect reality, right? Well, what is it going to do in terms of application and change? Similarly, qualitative studies that sort of just report on 3 themes, like here, I talked to people, here are the 3 things they said. It's not really building the explanation and the insight, sort of adding that piece that academic researchers can, that can then be useful for folks in this future. And sometimes I think, as I say here, the mirrors start facing one another, because somebody will say, well, this study is going to show that organizations are communicatively constructed, and then the conclusion is the study showed that organizations are communicatively constructed, right? So we're sort of leaving out that application component. And critical theorists can be the same here. So I said they're mirror breaking sometimes. Critical deconstruction, showing us that the way things are is not how they have to be, is a critical step. But we can just leave the mirror broken if we are not engaging that praxis step. So I was very proud of myself creating this little model, not very artistic, of closing the loop of theorizing from practice and for practice, right, of doing both of those steps. And we're seeing a lot of this. We're seeing this exciting growth of engaged research, community-based participatory research, CPPR. But I still see people struggling sometimes with how to move from doing CPPR into how to publish and theorize from it, how to engage something that is so context sensitive without creating work that is entirely context dependent, right, that is only relevant to that one situation. So I encourage, as we move forward, to think about developing those transferable insights, which is something, qualitative researchers talk about. For example, sometimes people will create a process by which local people were able to not only participate, but maybe take an active leadership role in an intervention, let's say. But sometimes people will frame that process as a limitation, right? Well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go through this process, rather than realizing the insights about that process are the transferable insight that other people might be able to use. And then another trick, of course, is that we have to transfer the insight. So when we do CPPR work, we need to start by looking at what other people have done, so that we're not reinventing the wheel. We're not Christopher Columbus coming along and realizing, oh, it was really hard to get people involved. But like, yeah, everyone that does CDPR sort of knows that, right? So what are the unique insights that come out of your project? Another challenge as we move forward with applied research, I think, is to delve more deeply into reflexivity. So as we theorize for practice, how are we orienting to the status quo? What are our taken for granted assumptions? So from my two areas, organizational communication and health communication, for example, why should we develop practices that maximize worker productivity? Whose interest is that project in? I guess I'm not telling people necessarily what values to have, but you have to have a really good explanation for why, and not just assume that that's going to be good for everybody. Lifestyle dogmas in health communication can be highly problematic. The advice can be flat out wrong. So, why is that your focus? Let's not get really good at hitting the wrong target. Another issue in challenges is in reflexivity. Whose practices are we focused on? Who are we including? Who are we excluding? I have a picture here of a publication by Orby et al., Race Matters in Applied Communication Research. This was, I think, a special issue under Mohan. And one of the things that they're talking about here is that when you look at applied research, you have these overwhelmingly white populations unless race is the focus of the study, and then we see populations that are not all white. So these are the kind of changes we need to make. I'm highlighting here a few examples of work that I've been excited to publish. This flow that comes when we're talking, or water metaphors for rethinking intercultural communication, theorized from First Nations in Australia. We also have this challenging color evasion and democratic dialogue using critical race discourse. So I think that progress is being made, but we need to do a lot more in that area. Another issue here, and this is a challenge for everybody, and me included, is really focusing on the idea of communication insights. So when we're thinking about what we're focusing on, what really are important concerns to address? What don't we already know, and why is that important? So, of course, that means things like going beyond the flimsy rationale for why findings aren't obvious, right, or why a hypothesis is important. Going beyond, as I said, sharing, like these are the three themes that people talked about, to focusing on understanding and explanation. Why is this happening? Whether you're using causal language or more historical, contextual, cultural factors, really bringing our insights into what is happening helps us understand how things might change. And then how can we facilitate action? And what I'd like to see more of when we think about facilitating action in pieces in JACR is we need to understand what is going on and make specific suggestions for what can be changed, rather than sometimes we get very general sort of ideas that somebody somewhere can be doing something, but it's not necessarily clear that those folks aren't already doing it. And I have this picture of the bananas here because my husband works in market research, and we talk about the difference between data versus findings versus insight. So when he worked in food and beverage, he found, we're interested in coffee, and we get this data that people who buy coffee buy bananas. Oh, interesting. Gosh, maybe we should co-sell. Maybe people really like that flavor. What should we be doing? And over time they realize, no, everyone just buys bananas. So that data is true for everybody. For anything that people buy at the store, there's a connection to bananas. And the reason I tell that story is that we are going to be inundated as we think to the future with data, particularly as we develop AI. But the future of insights isn't AI, right? It's the human component that we bring, that meaning making that we bring to this shower of data. So again, I talked about the idea of moving beyond general suggestions for, what we do with the insights from applied research. There are a lot of different ways to do that. There's not just one way. So, of course, we welcome work that's really applying and evaluating interventions, actions, initiatives, whether that's as a research article or as a field report. There's, folks that are actually doing the step of educating the relevant practitioners or groups that you want to create the change and documenting and assessing that step. And then, but those are not always possible. So can you identify who specifically might be implementing these insights? How can they be reached? And how do your insights differ from what they're currently doing? And obviously, anytime we're thinking about making suggestions for change, we need to be humble about that, right? So what are the relevant boundaries? What are the contexts? What are the uncertainties that we face? So that is, as I said, some of my vision and some of what we've done to achieve that vision at JACR, and then what I think some of the challenges in moving applied communication research forward. Mohan also asked me to talk a little bit about my own position as a critical health and organizational scholar. And I think I'm hoping that some of what I say here is relevant, has the potential to create some conversations among critical scholars in particular. I mentioned that I consider myself a critical pragmatist, although I only recently have actually articulated the impact of pragmatism on my research. As a critical theorist, I view research as partly about reclaiming conflict, that is, seeing what seems to be consensus and looking for ways that communication is reinforcing power inequities, looking at things like ideology and hegemony. But the goal of that, of course, is to transform that conflict through praxis. So engaging communication to resist and reconfigure those dominant power relations, and I'm particularly interested in organizing transformative social change. And where does the pragmatism element come in for me is, there's some meta-theoretical stuff here, but I think I'll focus primarily on this idea of the experimental efforts at organizing change. Needing to widen the democratic experience, that we're constantly seeing how different groups and different ideas are left out of this ideal of democracy. But what specifically can we do to change that? Eddie Glaude Jr. talks about we experiment, we tinker, we try again, right? And he's very clear-eyed about that. So this experimentation working. That experimentation faces the real severe problems. Eddie Glaude Jr. talks about the blues. He calls it the evils, like recognizing the evils of slavery and nonetheless getting up and experimenting and trying to make things better, trying to reduce suffering. I've run into some interesting debates as I've transitioned from work that's more focused on critique to work that's more focused on social change. Not surprising that some people would be suspicious about pragmatism. The word seems like expediency, but the critical pragmatists are really sure to say those are not the same thing. But I think there are a couple of interesting debates that we need to have as critical scholars, some questions we need to ask ourselves. And one is, when is the good the enemy of the perfect? This is something critical scholars ask a lot. When does a form of resistance, when does a type of change just release pressure so that people feel like their issues are addressed, but it really left the system in place. It really just wasted your time and prevented larger changes from happening. But there's a second question I think we should ask, which is, when is the perfect the enemy of the good? And by the good, I mean the equitable, right? And I get uncomfortable even asking that question, because in the U.S., President Obama would say that when he was promoting something that could have been a lot more significant, right? Something that was pretty incremental in its form of change. But I think it's important for us to ask that question, because when we view all efforts at change as, well, that's too small to change capitalism, that's not important. Well, that effort actually reinforces capitalism. When everything is viewed through that lens, that capitalist reproduction logic, there's no reason to try. And critical scholars, and I'm guilty of this, think about that big long-term change, but that is a form of privilege that's not addressing people's short-term lived immediate needs. I liken that to thinking about food system change. If someone tells you they're hungry, okay, be right back, I'm going to go change the food system, right? We know that that's not going to address that short-term need. So there's some really complex relationships here between individual approaches to change and whether that's reinforcing or changing larger systems. But as a pragmatist, what I'm trying to encourage is the idea that those are empirical questions. They are not philosophical questions. They are not something, as the picture shows here, something to be answered from our armchairs. We need to be out there. We need to be tracing long-term what are the effects of these different efforts. And long-term is difficult in academia, so that's one of the reasons that doesn't always get done. So just briefly, in terms of some of the things that I've done, from critique and application, again, not always doing both at the same time. I started off, my dissertation was a critique of workplace health promotion based on worker perspectives. So it was more of a critique of lifestyle discourses and how those organize consent to managerial power and occupational hazards. Again, that was focused on critique, but it's important. People ask me, why? How could you possibly? It's a win-win. Why would you criticize workplace health promotion? And now the New York Times has an article calling it a scam. So critique has really changed the discourse about that. But I wasn't sort of happy with just leaving it at that level. So I wanted to know, where is resistance happening? Because I didn't see a lot in my research at the time. Where do we see folks that are trying to create healthier work? And I looked at grassroots activism, so groups that were thinking about bringing together occupational and environmental health to overcome that job blackmail, that idea that any changes that would make work safer is going to cost somebody a job, right? I looked at grassroots activism in terms of challenging those lifestyle discourses to focus on the environment and challenging elite risk discourses. And now where I've been trying to head is also thinking about not just pushing back on the corporation, but really trying to create alternatives. So one of those projects is looking at this equitable food initiative, which is a third-party verification model from which I theorized what I call a critically holistic and worker-centered model of work health that integrates mental, physical, social, environmental, and economic components. It's really broad, but it prioritizes the workplace-generated sources of illness and seeks to institutionalize worker voice in not just health decision-making, but all of health decision-making, because we know that having a say over our lives, having adequate income and physical safety, that those are major, major components of our health status. Thinking about those critical debates that I talked about earlier, though, the Equitable Food Initiative model is limited, right? That's certainly not going to be the answer to the problems of labor for everyone. But the lens that I used, again, that critical pragmatist lens, is on how can we build on this experimentation. This is a situation where workers are on teams with management so that the standards that were themselves created with agricultural labor groups can be implemented every day and not just once a year when some inspector comes by. That's an innovation. How can we build on that? And in fact, we've seen that model being incorporated into things like the Fair Food Fight from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is a union organization. And how can we consider improving working conditions and income for workers as a basis for more political engagement? So we're not occupying their time with this effort in ways that prevent other kinds of advocacy efforts. And then a second example, a comparison point to an effort that's trying to create much broader social change, is the One Worker, One Vote movement for unionized, worker-owned cooperatives. As you can see here, I was looking at Co-op Cincy, so that's here in Cincinnati, where their goal is an economy that works for all, creating ownership opportunities for people from underserved and historically marginalized groups, and nurturing businesses accountable to communities. So they're sustainable, they address community needs like food access, for example. And I just last month, I think, published a piece in Monograph. I couldn't send it to JACR, so that's in Monograph's Pragmatic Utopianism and the Union Cooperative Movement. So I pitched this movement as utopianism insofar as they want to transform the whole economy from extraction, from inequality to solidarity and equity, drawing from the Spanish Mondragon model. So that's part of my goal there, to create healthy work and sustainable and equitable economies. My argument is that all the pieces of this movement, stronger economy, meeting community needs, building community, building ownership, is how we really prevent pandemics. It's how we prevent misinformation and disinformation thrives where we are individualized and where there is heavy inequality. That's how we become so partisan. But the pragmatic component of that is that that's a really big goal, and they're starting small. And they're starting realistically. They're pairing those ambitious values with flexible tools to create these businesses in practice, improvisationally, growing from successes. As one of the leaders from Mondragon said, it's not just a utopia, it's a utopia for realistic people. So we're going to achieve democratic organizations, wage solidarity, the sovereignty of labor. We're going to achieve social transformation, one practical effort at a time. So just in terms of the larger themes that I was talking about, I hope that this piece shows that closing of the loop that I talked about earlier, that I theorized pragmatic utopianism from practice. Lopez and Banyasi-Smith were theorizing Black women's participation in anti-Trump campaigns, despite knowing that the Democrats had not fully served their interests, and then theorized that through more practice, through the One Worker, One Vote network, and through a long-term research commitment on my part, starting as just an advocate, an attendee, to becoming a board member for one of their organizations over more than 8 years. I hope that the theory brings insights into practice so that more transformational efforts can understand the wisdom of this group and how they can apply that in their own situation. I talked about their dialectical framing of everyone's assumption that you're either going to be successful or you're going to stick to your belief system. Like, how do you get through that doubt is the primary problem that these utopian organizers have. And I talked about the different ways that they overcome that through strategic capacity building and how they engage flexibilities, but did so in a way that tied the flexibility to the values rather than, again, get to that idea that pragmatism is about expediency. As far as the good and the perfect goes, I hope that research contributes to the idea that there are multiple paths to social justice, including things like entrepreneurial efforts, that we shouldn't dismiss them out of hand because they're market-based, and also that in engaging these kinds of pragmatics, critical theories are not just prefiguring a future, but really enacting these critical imaginaries in practice right now, so that we're not overlooking those efforts. And I'll stop there so we have time for questions. I do have the QR codes there in case you'd like to follow JACR's new social media outlets.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that vision for JACR and then connecting that to your research and really elucidating how this concept of critical pragmatics plays out through your own research practice and your editing practice. So for our YouTube and Facebook audience, please post your questions on the comment section and I will read those out to Heather. And for our Zoom audience, please go ahead and raise your hand and I will call upon you to engage in the conversation. Heather, I wanted to begin by sort of giving you a practical example, perhaps, and walking through this concept of critical pragmatics. So, you talked about the U.S. elections, and one of the things that, I'm seeing through my activist networks on Palestine solidarity is the organizing of particularly Arab Americans around the elections. That on one hand, one thread of tactics seems to be seeking to engage the Democratic platform, right? The other thread of tactic is the no vote tactic. Now, these can be looked at both as tactical responses to the broader issue, which is U.S. The funding of weapons to Israel, which sort of constitutes the backdrop of the genocidal attack on Palestine. So I guess the question for you is, how do you take critical pragmatism and work through these two different threads of responses to the question at hand, which is U.S. arms support for Israel?
Yeah, that's a great example. I'm so glad you asked it. And it's one that you and I sometimes have debated, so that's good too. So I think that the pragmatic lens to critical theorizing encourages us to think about the effects of our choices in terms of moving down the field and creating that opportunity for more choices, right? So when I talked about, let me see if I can go backwards here. When I talked about that idea of strategic capacity building, I'm theorizing that from Marshall Gans, and he's basing that on the work of, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the UFW. The idea is what moves will allow you to make more moves later. And while that sounds kind of obvious, it is actually a pretty different approach than maybe if our focus is on, is this action right now, the ontological status of the action in and of itself, right? Is this morally right? Is this morally wrong? But instead, what moves us, use a U.S. football metaphor, but what moves us down the road in the direction we want to go? And I think when we're talking about people's very lives and the existence of whole cultures are on the line, we have to think very strategically about where our actions are taking us. And unfortunately, in the United States, we have a winner-take-all system, and we have the electoral college. And the result of that is that there is this small group of people who have this outlandish amount of power in determining who the winners are. And so, ideally, movements are thinking proactively about how to get the public on their side so that it doesn't come to election time and suddenly we're left with this terrible choice, right? So I also mentioned that Lopez and Bunyasi-Smith were specifically talking about critical pragmatism in terms of Black women's participation in these anti-Trump, right? This was, I think, the first election for the Democrats. She said they were not mystified for one moment about what the Democrats had and had not done for them. But they embraced that hope that if they could support Democrats and keep Trump out, that would give them the platform to continue to organize. And that's how I see right now a no vote is a vote for someone who has absolutely declared their absolute fealty to Israel, and someone who will end our chances of curbing the United States' impact on climate change, which is massive, will roll back human rights for any number of groups, and has declared mass deportations on day one, and the imprisonment of political opponents. So again, that shift from a strategy thinking, from more that ontological position, I think is still getting at critical goals.
Thank you for that response, Heather. What you also bring up in this sense, perhaps, is sort of this kind of a long-term thinking, right, in terms of what's going to work for the long term. I suppose, the question with regard to that is that when you're in the midst of extreme violence, what are the registers for cultivating that kind of long-term thinking? Because at this point, sort of, if you think about from a Palestinian perspective, it seems, like they're building networks with the Global South, bringing the U.S. to the International Criminal Court. Those seem to be much more plausible pathways than sort of this politics of the U.S., right? So I'm just thinking about it from a Palestinian-American perspective and listening to folks on the No War campaign. It almost seems that, this idea that either of the choices you make, the weapons are going to continue to flow. So perhaps the no vote is a moral choice, while actually working to pragmatically organize the Global South, because that is the global majority, to holding both U.S. and Israel to account in the international court. So, would love to hear your thoughts on how you balance the immediate, when sort of violence is played out, and different ways of thinking about what is the long term,
Yeah, so if thinking specifically about the U.S., because that question about the voting, I think you're right that thinking about the long term, there are folks, so many people who have been advocating for Palestinian rights. And I think if we look back now, we can see that they have had a big big impact, obviously globally, but even in the U.S., so that the discourse has changed, that Democrats are talking about things somewhat differently. Again, they're still hemmed in electoral college-wise, but they have changed the discourse. And my point in bringing that up is not to say that enough has changed. It hasn't. But my point is to say, people said it wasn't worth it. Don't even do it. It wasn't worth it. It was. Like, look how much it did. And if more people believed, more people would have moved. We might be further down the road, right? That's one of the things I said about the union cooperative movement. It's the doubt that is getting in the way. People doubt that you can do it. If they didn't doubt it, it'd be done, right? So not doubting, playing the long game, out maneuvering the U.S. altogether is obviously a critical component, right? That's the larger discourse that we're playing in. But we have to recognize the severe limitations of our current political situation, and that if those are the changes we have to make if we want voice for marginalized people in the future when it comes to U.S. not only internal politics but our hegemony over other countries, that we have to think more about that long game and those bigger issues, or we're going to keep coming back to these horrendous choices that you make when you just look at one piece of the pie.
Any questions from our audience on Zoom? Mahbub, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for your excellent presentation on applied communication research. Sorry. I am particularly interested in field report section of the ACR, as the field org always have some challenges, especially for those who, like us, work at the Global South. Now I would like to come to my question. As a researcher, we always try to translate research or theory into practice. I work for a group of refugees, like Rohingya refugees, who sometimes called as the new Palestinians. Rohingya refugees, those who lived in various refugee camps of Bangladesh, where no one, even the researcher, are not allowed to enter the camps without permission. So I would like to know your opinion, how applied communication can work for the refugees who are confined in a refugee camp, even surrounded by fencing, either in Bangladesh or any other places of the world. How applied communication can help those refugees. Thank you.
Yeah, so if I understood your question, you're asking about the idea that if we equate applied communication research with engagement with people that we're not able to access, then how do we think about that? And I'm really glad you asked that, because I hope that throughout my presentation I emphasize the idea that there are always multiple ways, right, of achieving goals and multiple ways of considering what counts as applied research. And I'm really interested in including more artistic ways of knowing. This was something that Mohan had created, was an opportunity for artistic work. And when I came along, they said, oh, we don't have to just have that on the website anymore. We can actually incorporate that into the journal. And so my hope was to incorporate that into either field research or as regular research articles. I think I have a pretty traditional looking profile, so I don't think people know to bring me these things, but I do want that. So I guess my point in saying that is that we know that these groups who are experiencing these issues do have voice, and that there are different ways that we can access that and share those examples of voice. We can also highlight the problems on behalf sometimes of people who are unable to speak, raising those issues. Like I said, rhetorical and textual analysis is extremely welcome at JACR, as long as you are talking about what can we do, right? What can people do as a result of the knowledge that you bring? So yeah, I'm so glad you asked that.
Yes, thank you. Because they are not allowed to talk, just they are confined in a refugee camp.
Right, and there are so many ways. There are so many ways that people are rendered voiceless if they are afraid to speak, right? And so there are multiple ways then that we need to engage those populations. That, again, to me, that's a part of doing the research that matters, right? That people's lives are on the line. There may be any number of different ways of bringing attention to that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions? Please to raise your hand. I have a journal-related question because of our Global South audiences that often come to the CARE space and engage. And one of these questions relates to Global South researchers. So thanks for that space for the reports, as well as continuing with those the sort of other forms, multimodal or multimedia interventions. Now, this is a question that often one hears from Global South researchers who are doing research and then wanting to get published in our journals, often following the dominant frameworks of doing research, meaning either quantitative or qualitative research, and then wanting to publish that in our journals. And in that process, facing a number of barriers, all the way from language, usage kinds of issues. And I know that TNF says that you can take the language support, but that is, one has to pay for it. That can be expensive. To APA, to these continual new rules that Taylor and Francis seems to impose, things like, I just saw there is now a new rule about getting permission from anyone that is named in your work, So those kinds of newly introduced conventions also, like, one has to keep up with them, but they're also quite problematic in the say, for instance, someone is doing textual analysis of hate groups or Hindutva groups in India, and one does an analysis of the X account of a prominent Hindutva figure. So does one have to go and seek permission from that figure to publish that article? And these kinds of things, I just got that question from someone. And these kinds of things become really problematic because of the ways in which these rules and bureaucratic norms keep seeming to be imposed by TNF. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I agree about the challenges, absolutely. And as editor, I have responded. My primary tack has been when there are pieces that are obviously strong research, they're just not quite, I mean, honestly, that's not different from any research where they're just not quite getting that theoretical contribution and practical contribution. I've leaned heavily into the sort of reject and resubmit, so not sending it to reviewers, because we get so many pieces, that you're not always sending it to board members, right? So you're relying on guests to do the labor, and that's wonderful of them, but you can't be sure that they'll keep these issues in mind, to have an open mind to, let the paper stay in the process, and how we can adapt our standards as well as expecting others to adapt to ours. So, and in doing that, I've tried to be as reflexive as possible about, here's where your piece is unusual in some way, and that's great. Let's do things a different way. I'm saying fix this or fix that, or sometimes the clarity is an issue. Yeah, but I am not an editor who, there are grammatical mistakes, it's out. Like, that's the last of my concerns. We can work with that throughout the process. But yes, it's very much, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to create the newsletter, was to help talk about those issues for board members and that kind of thing so that we can have some of those conversations. But, you know, I'm not sure if I knew about this change that you're talking about with Taylor and Francis in terms of naming. I think the most that I knew was that permissions need to be listed for any authors on the piece. So that's something I'll have to go, but it's not something they've communicated to me.
And you see, this is exactly what I mean, Heather. It's like these ongoing requirements and processes that seem to be set up by Taylor and Francis that both speak to their market logics. I'm assuming they're also trying to protect themselves from lawsuits and things like that, but entirely bureaucratic, neoliberal, market-driven logic, which can be quite astounding and which seem to be introduced on an ongoing basis. And part of that also, it seems, that say, for instance, if you're writing something, an analysis on Trump's Twitter account, because, you know, everyone knows who Trump is, there is no such pressure or demand that you need to have Trump's consent before you're going to publish that. But because there is no knowledge of Hindutva and Hindutva networks, if you're doing something similar with a Hindutva actor, then there is a demand for these specifics because there isn't that knowledge. So I suppose, you know, the broader question is that seems to be this fundamental power inequality, you know, that plays out with market logics, lack of knowledge. That means that for a global South scholar, one has to continually prove themselves. So the barriers are multiplied manifold beyond just the language and the usage kinds of issues, you know?
Yeah, and like I said, I think that's it's an issue for all scholars. So I think sometimes there's both market logics, and sometimes they are trying to protect people from, you know, malicious research or that kind of thing as well. But as you said, the pressure for conformity, that we have to do things one way, becomes a problem. But then ironically, it's not really done one way, because you hear about it at some journals and not others, and, you know, for some pieces and not others, depending on who you're working with. So it's definitely something that we need to continue, as, you know, in this case, it's NCA that needs to hold their feet to the fire. We just learned this year that Taylor and Francis has sold all of our published works to AI firms, and they're continuing to do so. And the editors raised this, when are we going to talk about this? There are people now who are not publishing in Taylor and Francis journals as a result. And so I think right now the conduit needs to be NCA, but I also think this is a good point where we really need to rethink the relationship between NCA and ICA, because if NCA is our focal point for this relationship with Taylor and Francis, that's going to emphasize U.S. interests. And it's not to say that people in the Global South aren't having an influence on NCA, but obviously a more international organization would bring more voices to the table.
Thank you, Heather.
Yeah, we have yet to have that meeting about them selling all the work to AI.
That is quite astounding, really, you know?
Yeah.
And I suppose, you know, related to that is, and, you know, we had written about this in our piece on open science, you know, decolonizing open science, which is that issues about the big five publishing houses anyways, which seems like a predatory, extractive, extreme capitalist model of knowledge economy, you know. So I guess that's also an NCA question in terms of when we are engaging with ComSoWhite and questions of decolonization, how do we divest from extractive models of publishing, you know?
Exactly. So we can follow One Worker, One Vote, and develop our own cooperatively owned publishing. Yeah.
Mal has said that ICA is moving to OUP. ICA, most of the ICA journals are OUP. They have been OUP for a while, you know.
But they have slightly different structures as well, right? So some of this is, we have these legacy commitments to the way things have been done.
Yes. And I love your cooperative thing. And I think, again, the Global South teaches us and offers us model like the Latin American open science model with publishing. They're like most of their communication journals are both open and based on this cooperative platform model, you know.
Right. Yeah. The one worker, one vote, you know, it comes out of impoverished people in the Basque region of Spain, right? This is where innovation happens.
Yeah.
Where people have to change. They have no choice, right?
And I love, Heather, what you said about market and enterprise. Maybe, you know, I do want to know if others have questions, but otherwise I would want to wrap up with that. You know, I love how you engage with that question of enterprise as potentially a positive or a transformative space, and the need to look at enterprise as a transformative space. I suppose, you know, like here, one of the things we see, for instance, in Aotearoa is with, you know, Kaupapa Maori and the Maori economy, which is a large, substantive economy, but that is organized around logics of care, community, aroha, connection, you know. So perhaps there are ways of thinking about even reorganizing the markets in new ways, you know.
Yeah, and this, you know, again, the movement that I was looking at is very much coming out of studies of the Global South and alternate values and alternate ways of thinking about the economy. My critical commitment is that there's no one right way to do things.
Yeah.
And so I don't think and I think sometimes critical theorists fall into that trap. So, you know, just one example of, there are a couple of these really great food system scholars, but, you know, like their edited book is just so focused on anything that isn't government regulation of the food system and socialist delivery of food is bad. And, you know, I think we need multiple competing offers, because we know that governments can reinforce inequitable, can and will reinforce inequitable power relationships. We know the market left unchecked will do what it is doing, right? So we need these multiple ways of doing things to give people who don't have power in the current system standing in order to create these many options, so that we're thinking about democracy every day, everywhere, how people can have voice, again, connection and autonomy throughout their lives, and not just in these little carved out spaces.
Awesome. And that's a beautiful way to wrap up this conversation. Thank you, Heather, so much for spending your time with us, for sharing with us insights on your editorial strategies for Jacker, which are transformative and will build new registers, and also with your research program and the ways in which you are grappling with these concepts of critical pragmatism. Lovely to have you.
Thank you so much for letting me be a part of this. It's great. You're an example of all the things that I was talking about, so it's a little bit of an intimidating audience in that sense.
Thank you.